U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken believes Africa is the future of the global community. Blinken met with South Africa's International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi Pando, yesterday, and that was to discuss bilateral relations. The three-nation visit is aimed at building and strengthening ties between Africa with the U.S. That's Blinken's three-day tour, as it were, or three-state tour, I should say. For more on what this means for all the countries involved, let's bring in former South Africa ambassador to the U.S., that's Ebrahim Rasool, who joins us via our video link this morning. It's great to have you on the program, sir. Thanks so much indeed for making time to chat to us. What has arguably stood out from this engagement, or at least the media engagement part, was, sentiments around Minister Pando saying a country like South Africa will not allow itself to be bullied by any Western states to take a position, for instance, on the Russia-Ukraine war. How do you think that landed diplomatically?
Look, I think that there are some areas in diplomacy that historically we've agreed to disagree on. When I was there, it was the invasion of Iraq and all of those kind of things, the Arab Spring, and so forth. I think the current issue is Ukraine, but underneath it all is an enduring relationship between South Africa and the USA that is based on trade and investment, and I think common values. The US wants to be a non-racial, a democratic, a better society. That's what South Africa wants to be as well. And so I think that there's more that unites us than what divides us. And this certainly, the big thing out of the last few days have been the resumption of the strategic relationship between South Africa and the USA that culminated over the last few days in the strategic dialogue between the two ministers.
Yeah. I mean, the cynics, I guess, might be asking questions around if there had always been such a close relationship between the two countries, why did it take so long for someone at Antony Blinken's level in terms of status in government to visit this country?
I think that the simple answer is Trump. I think that it was President Trump who had no regard for Africa, and he used some choice phrases to describe his thinking of South Africa. He cancelled some of the Obama-era issues, such as the Green Climate Fund. He slapped tariffs on things like steel and aluminium that made it very difficult for South Africa to export to the U.S. And so we all probably had to sit out the Trump presidency in order to reach this moment in which we can disagree with a superpower like the United States, but continue with the pursuit of South Africa's interests. And it's largely in the area of trade, investment, and being a proxy for Africa in the U.S.'s relationships with the continent.
Yeah. It was interesting to hear Antony Blinken put to bed some concerns around the U.S. competing with China for dominance in Africa. Part of what he said is that the U.S. is not really interested in that. Do you think he went far enough to allay some of those fears?
No, look, I think that while the U.S. was asleep at the wheel under Trump, and while the U.S. was busy with its adventures in the Ukraine and making everyone choose that, China continued to build out its relationship, and Africa could not stand back from its strategic interests in needing destinations for trade and needing sources of investment. And so that's a natural consequence that the U.S. must compete with now that China has filled a vacuum that the U.S. vacated. And so, in a sense, I think South Africa and Africa would agree that we do want to reach the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit that has been announced by Vice President Kamala Harris. I think we do want to look at this Prosper Africa Together that was announced by the Biden administration and really see if there is a successor, a more equitable successor to the African Growth and Opportunities Act that involves multilateral trade arrangements rather than the unilateral ones. So look, I think we are going to get past the noise and we need to get back to what are values and what are interests that we share together.
Yeah, and we'll speak about the effectiveness of diplomacy in just a moment, but it's an interesting that response you've just given. Do you reckon that China is in fact posing a threat to taking the U.S.'s position in Africa insofar as diplomacy is concerned?
I think China will certainly be very active at the diplomatic level, but the quality sometimes of the economic exchanges are not comparable. While the U.S. is our third largest trading partner, with something like almost 120 billion rands worth of trade with the USA, I think that South Africa would have to admit that what we largely send to China are raw materials, what we largely export to the USA are largely manufactured. And manufactured goods have more jobs that go with it, whereas raw materials have fewer jobs and develop fewer skills. And so we prefer a destination that kicks in our manufacturing sector as well, and that's what the U.S. Has to offer. I mean, the U.S. has 600 companies, more or less, in South Africa, and they employ almost 200,000 South Africans. That's not comparable with the kind of volumes that I think in employment that someone like China offers us. So look, I think we of necessity have to continue to develop our relationships with China, with other BRICS, with other southern nations. But I do think that the Holy Grail still remains largely how we send manufactured goods to the Northern Hemisphere.
Interesting. Again, entering into these bilateral discussions between Minister Pando and Secretary of State Blinken, there were always concerns about, the effectiveness of diplomacy in a context where the global community is facing so many challenges, including, by the way, the failure of being able to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. Interestingly enough, what is also unique about the discussions yesterday is around power dynamics. The U.S. as a superpower, trying to say to the world that they're coming as an equal player to the table with a country like South Africa. Is that something that we should be concerned about on the back of these discussions?
Look, I think that that very clearly it is not within South Africa's power to have stopped Russia. But I think it is within South Africa's power to say we cannot allow a unilateral, a unipolar world from developing. And maybe that's part of our hesitancy for taking sides in the Ukraine conflict, because we can see the foolishness of wanting the whole of Russia to be surrounded, for example, by NATO. Why do we have a need for NATO if there is not a bipolar world? I think Russia doesn't threaten the U.S. to the extent that it has to be surrounded by that. So South Africa was very thoughtful about actually staying out, wanting to have a peaceful resolution, but we're not going to allow ourselves to be punished, and we shouldn't allow Africa to be punished just because we're taking a different position. I think what the U.S. is now discovering, and that is what the Antony Blinken visit does say, is that Africa has intrinsic value by itself and not as a theater for a new Cold War. We can't be the collateral damage in what is happening between Russia and the USA, that we, in fact, would need to be reckoned on our own. And Africa has been getting its act together. We have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That should make it attractive to not only the USA, but especially the USA, to do business with us. All the stuff that they've been asking us, we have been complying with. I think we've got a greater democracy, human rights, and peace dividend than was ever imagined before. And so that makes it attractive. So if the USA wants to have access to our growing middle class market, if it wants to have access to the skills of our young population, if it does want to have access to the vast materials that are available here, the U.S. will act in its interest and not in the interest of holding us to the criterion of, do you support us in Ukraine or don't you?
Interesting responses. Some might say diplomatic responses themselves. Ebrahim Rasool, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate your time this morning. Ebrahim Rasool is the former SA ambassador to South Africa. Once again, thanks very much indeed.